Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on the Dairy Signal. We're going to be talking about a topic that is something that we might not necessarily always have on our mind, but is incredibly important to what happens on our farm and ultimately the environment around us, and that's nitrate leaching. But before we dive into that topic, let's take a step back and talk a little bit about today in history, because for many who maybe have been to Washington, D.C. around this time, March is kind of a spectacular time to visit the DC area because we will all see those lovely cherry blossom trees. And it was on this day in 1912 that the first of those two trees were planted along the Potomac River there. And that was actually marked the first of over 3,000 trees being planted in the Washington, D.C. area as a gift from the Japanese government. So that is your fun fact for you this afternoon. A little bit different than what we're going to be diving into this afternoon, but just as fun nonetheless. And joining us this afternoon to talk about nitrate leaching on multiple different scales here is Lindsay Hartfield, who is a research program manager with University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension for the Discovery Farms program, as well as Kelsey Highland, who's the agriculture water quality outreach specialist with UW-Madison Extension in Northwest Wisconsin. So thank you both for being here today. We're excited to dive into this topic and really get a whole new look, if you will, at what's going on with nitrate leaching, what can we be thinking about on our farms and everything in between. But with that, I would love to hear from both Lindsay and Kelsey here just a little bit about yourselves before we dive in. So those who might be unfamiliar with you and your work can get to know you a little bit before we get started here today.
Yeah, I can go ahead and get us started. My name is Lindsay Hartfield, and as Amber said, I'm the research program manager for the Discovery Farms program here in Wisconsin. I started in this role just over 2 years ago, and so really excited that I get to work with private farms across the state to understand the water quality on their farm, what practices we can do to better that water quality. So I'm really enjoying my role and excited to be here today talking with you all.
Well, thank you, Lindsay. And Kelsey, would you mind also giving us a little bit of introduction about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again, Amber, so much for having us here on the Dairy Signal. My name is Kelsey Highland, and I'm an agriculture water quality outreach specialist here in Northwest Wisconsin. So we do a lot of work on kind of nitrogen management, phosphorus, and how ag production practices impact water quality here in Wisconsin. And we're really lucky to be able to work closely with the Discovery Farms team and all the awesome research they've been doing for the past 20 years with farmer participants. So excited to share some of that with you all today.
Well, thank you, Kelsey. And I know as we dive into this topic that there might be questions from audience listeners who are watching live. But if you have questions, feel free to type those in via Slido. If you're on a desktop device, that is to your right. And if you are on a mobile device, you can scroll on and type your questions in down below. So with that, we're just going to get started here today. And I'm going to hand it over to Kelsey as she kind of takes a broad scope of what's going on with nitrate leaching across the state before we dive in a little bit more with Lindsay, who will be a little bit more specific with her discussion points. So Kelsey, if you want to get us started here, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And those slides are showing up okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'm going to start out with a little bit of a broad overview of nitrate leaching kind of across the Midwest to really set up Lindsay to talk about some nitrate leaching research that's happening with the Discovery Farms program and some of our dairy systems that we have here. So first, to set us up, I'll just give kind of an overview of what I'll be talking about today. So we'll go over first the state of groundwater quality here in Wisconsin based on some of the research we have. And we'll go over some nitrate leaching basics in agricultural systems first, just to set us up before we dive a little bit more into the research, looking at some broader trends. But we'll also look at some Wisconsin specific issues regarding our timing and our climate here before talking about some potential solutions and moving forward in terms of nitrogen management. So to start, every 5 years, the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection puts out a groundwater report based on private well water sampling they do across the state of Wisconsin. And so they use a stratified random sampling approach with this. So they're really able to capture the diversity of our Wisconsin landscapes and also able to track changes over time in our groundwater. So for those of you who are tuning in and can see this map, or maybe you'll check it out later, but all of the circles on the map represent different wells that were tested across the state. And then we also have a land use cover on this map. So the areas that are darker in green are where more than 75% of that land has been cultivated. So those gray circles are where no nitrate was detected in our well water. And then those orange circles are where between 2 milligrams and 10 milligrams per liter were detected. And those red circles are where we have 10 milligrams per liter detected. And 10 milligrams per liter is our drinking water standard here in Wisconsin because it can be associated with negative health outcomes, especially for some of our vulnerable populations like pregnant women and children. So from the results, they found that 7.3% of private wells exceeded that drinking water standard. And these are more likely to be found in areas with a greater percentage of cultivated land. So this kind of makes sense when we know we grow a lot of nitrogen hungry crops here in Wisconsin, but when those crops aren't able to make use of that nitrogen, if there's too much in the system, it can get into our groundwater that's used for drinking. I also wanted to share 32.7% of private wells were between that 2 milligrams per liter and 10 milligrams per liter. And I wanted to share this because while that's not at the drinking water exceedance, of course, if we're going to take a preventative approach and start looking at our nitrogen management, we want to focus on those areas, where we can maybe prevent getting into those exceedances in the first place. So given what we know about kind of our groundwater, what really is nitrate leaching and how does this happen in our ag systems? So really for this to happen, we need to have a source of that nitrogen in the first place, which is really largely impacted by our nitrogen management. And we'll talk a bit more about that in the coming slides. But we also need a transport factor, something to move that nitrate through the soil profile. So nitrate is the negatively charged form of nitrate, and it kind of readily moves with water because it doesn't stick to our largely negatively charged soils. So when we get those drainage conditions, it can move the nitrate and leach it through the soil profile. And our drainage is really impacted by things like precipitation, but also soil texture. If we have sandier soils, we tend to have higher drainage. And then also evapotranspiration, because we know our plants and crops are going to move water out of the system at different times of the year in different amounts. So if we think a bit more about what that surplus end balance really is, we have to think about the end balance of the soil in our cropping systems. So first considering our nitrogen inputs. So that includes our big ones like fertilizer and manure, but also things like crop residue or potentially nitrate that's in irrigation water, depending on where you are in the state. And then we have to think about the nitrogen that's removed from the system. So through crop harvest or potentially through nitrogen gas loss as well. And then there's also this storage component as well. So our organic nitrogen can be mineralized and transformed into this nitrate form, which again, readily moves with that water. But depending on the carbon content of the soil, that nitrate can also be immobilized back into that organic nitrogen, which kind of safely stays in the soil and won't move with water. So when we put all of those together, we get the total nitrogen balance of the soil. But what we see in a lot of our Midwestern cropping systems is that our nitrogen supply outweighs our nitrogen demand, leaving us in that surplus and balance conditions. So this nitrogen supply can come from things like fertilizer, manure, and then also nitrogen that's fixed by legumes, like the hairy vetch picture I have on this photo, that can eventually be transformed into that nitrate. And then, of course, it'll depend on the demand. If we have more crops, bigger roots, they're going to be demanding more N. So a researcher, Castman, and some colleagues, they really wanted to look at fertilizer uptake efficiency across Midwestern corn production systems. And what they found is that our corn crops are not so great at taking up nitrogen. We have a bit of a leaky system. So when they looked at nitrogen fertilizer uptake efficiency in Midwestern corn cropping production systems, so this is the amount of nitrogen that's captured in above ground biomass, it's about 37%. So this can vary a little bit from, study to study or year to year, but you rarely ever read a fertilizer uptake efficiency that's kind of above 50%. So this leaves us with a really big chunk of unused nitrogen. So about 63% if we're taking that average again that he found. And so when we think about this large chunk of unused nitrogen, we know that a portion of it can be lost as nitrogen gas. And this might be a function of our nitrogen placement, whether it's on the soil surface or maybe it's injected or banded where it's safer from those losses. We know that a portion is going to be temporarily stored in the soil as that organic matter, again, depending on that carbon content. But from our groundwater data that I was sharing earlier, we know that a large portion of it is also going to be leached to our groundwater in that nitrate. So given what we know generally about what nitrate leaching looks like in agricultural systems, some researchers really wanted to know what this kind of looks like across the Midwestern landscape on our actual farms and agricultural systems. So this is a meta-analysis, which is basically a way to combine a whole bunch of studies. So this was 325 studies across 12 Midwestern states, so over 1,400 observations. And what they're able to do by combining all of these studies is really look at the interactive impact of multiple management practices. So things like end management and how that interacts with soil texture and rainfall to really get a better understanding of what nitrate leaching generally looks like in the Midwest. So typically when we're only looking at maybe one individual study, we're just looking at soil texture, just looking at nitrogen management, but we know that our ag systems and farming in general is very complicated and we have all these interacting factors. So when you put these studies together, we're kind of able to get this broader lens and broader scope. So diving into what they found from this study, the first thing they looked at was vegetation type in nitrate leaching. So I'll describe the graph for those who maybe can't see it if you're going to check it out later, but we'll also walk through some of the numbers as well. So on the vertical axis, we have nitrate leaching in kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And I've also converted these in pounds per acre in that table on the right, just if you're more used to thinking in those units. And then on the horizontal axis, we have our different vegetation types that they looked at. And they looked at unfertilized treatments in the unshaded bars, and then also fertilized treatments in those in the shaded bars. And then there's also a number above each of those bars, which is the number of observations for each cropping systems. So you'll see for our corn, we had a lot of observations, almost 800. And then for our alfalfa and clover systems, not as many, about 12. So if we look at the total amount of nitrate leach in our potato systems, there was the highest amount of average nitrate, around 53 pounds per acre. And the reason we likely saw pretty high leaching in these potato systems is potatoes tend to have a higher nitrogen input than some of our other cash crops that we grow here in Wisconsin. So around 213 pounds per acre. And if we think about Wisconsin too, potato production tends to be concentrated in some of our sandier soil. So we have those really high drainage conditions. So potentially a lot of nitrogen moving through that soil profile. And then if we compare it to the lowest amount of leaching, that was the bioenergy crops, which included miscanthus and switchgrass, also some other grasses and poplar. And so these tended to leach 10 pounds per acre. And the reason we see less leaching in these perhaps is we tend to have more modest fertilizer or manure rates, around 72 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And these are also perennial crops that tend to be in the ground for a larger portion of the year. So we have those roots kind of demanding the end where they might be lost in some of our other systems. And if we keep moving down the line, what we saw in our corn systems was an average about 31 pounds per acre lost. And again, we know that corn is a nitrogen hungry crop, so a bit more nitrogen moving through the systems. And then next we have our alfalfa systems, which in these observations, and again, I will just say for the alfalfa that we only had 12 to 13 observations. So this is definitely something we need more research on. But the alfalfa and clover, we saw about 40 pounds per acre leach, which was actually a bit more than corn. And this kind of surprised us because when we think about alfalfa, it's a pretty deep-rooted perennial crop. So I really wanted to dive into some of the research and really understand why we were seeing this larger leaching number in our alfalfa clover systems. And there was this one study from Michigan that was comparing alfalfa in treatments that had manure versus no manure, and they had really similar yields. So what this suggests is that there was plenty of nitrogen in the soil. So that added manure, the alfalfa really couldn't make use of it, leaving those surplus end conditions where when drainage conditions arise, they can really move that nitrate through the soil profile. So while we definitely need more research on this question, I think it's kind of interesting to think about that even when we have deep-rooted perennial crops, we still need to be thinking about the amount of nitrogen that's added to those systems, especially manure too, because we know that adding manure to our alfalfa systems here in Wisconsin can be a common practice. And then in our soybeans, we tended to see a little bit less nitrate leached, around 25 pounds per acre. And we likely saw this because we know that In most cases, we're not adding nitrogen to our soybean crop, so just a little bit less nitrogen moving through the soil system. So the next thing that they looked at was crop rotation and nitrate leaching, because obviously most farmers are not just growing one crop. So how does rotation really impact those numbers? And so for those of you who are seeing this graph, it's set up really similar to the last one where we have that nitrate leaching on the vertical axis and then our different rotations on the horizontal axis. And what they found is that there was some evidence of reduced leaching in our corn soybean systems compared to continuous corn. So it was about 10.2 pounds an acre reduction. This wasn't statistically significant, but it does provide some evidence that when we add in a second crop that maybe has lower nitrogen needs, that we can potentially see reduced overall nitrogen. So I think this is just kind of an interesting thought experiment. You know, what would other rotations look like if we're introducing other crops that potentially have a lower nitrogen requirement? What would that mean for overall nitrate leaching? So the next thing they looked at was timing in nitrate leaching. And this data is specifically only coming from Wisconsin because timing and weather is so variable from state to state. So I wanted to make sure to just focus on Wisconsin data for this. So this comes from a study that was done in Arlington on silt loam soils, and it was looking at the timing of nitrate leaching using lysimeter technology that I won't steal Lindsay's thunder. She's going to go into a lot more detail about how these devices work. But basically, they were using the same technology that Lindsay will talk about later. And what they found is that 73 to 75% of all nitrate leaching happens between April 1st and June 30th. So really these early springtime periods are kind of early in the cropping season. And then when we included that January, February, March timeframe, it included about 88% of total leaching. So what this research showed us is that really the majority of nitrate leaching happens in between the growing seasons versus during the growing season. And if we think a little bit about what our fields look like in between the growing season, maybe really zeroing in on the springtime, it's March right now, so it's a good time to be thinking about this. So we might be in those surplus N balance conditions where we could have some unused N from the cropping season if it made it over the winter. Perhaps some spring nitrogen applications are starting to happen. But this is all happening where the demand for nitrogen is really low, especially if you don't have any cover crops or perennial in the systems. There's really nothing demanding that N. Mineralization might be starting to happen as those soils warm up so that organic N can then be transformed into that nitrate form that moves with water. So if we pair these kind of challenging surplus N balance conditions with high drainage, so we know our evapotranspiration is low right now because we don't, in most cases, have plants actively growing, and we have our snow melts and rainfall, potentially saturated soil conditions. So ultimately just a lot of water moving through the soil profile at this time. And if we think a little bit about our springtime here, this is some historical data from the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts from 1950 to 2023. And what this data shows is that across most of the state of Wisconsin, we're seeing an increase in our spring precipitation, especially in areas of the state where we have a lot of our agricultural land. And so this can vary from 10 to 20%. So if we have these increasing spring precipitation, we know that this could potentially exacerbate some of our nitrate leaching losses. So it really makes it a point that we need to be reducing that surplus and protecting it when we can with these challenging drainage conditions. And this is only expected to increase. So that's our historical data for Wisconsin, but they also have models that predict forward. So this next one is looking at 2040 to 2060 in our spring timeframe. And there's a predicted increase of about 10% during that springtime change again. So the last variable they looked at was corn yield and nitrate leaching. And for those looking at the screen, we have our, the solid line is a typical yield curve, which, you know, you might see in a lot of studies where eventually there comes a time when yield starts to plateau, where a crop can no longer make use of that extra N. So you can keep adding nitrogen, but you're not going to see a yield benefit. And what we see in terms of nitrate leaching, which is in that dashed line below, we can see that we have an opposite relationship. So as that yield starts to plateau, the supply is outweighing the demand, and we have these N surplus conditions that are pretty vulnerable to losses. So while that yield is plateauing, we see that nitrate leaching exponentially increase. So how do we start to think about moving down the leaching curve before I pass it over to Lindsay? So the first thing is really reducing that surplus end balance. And I think the first way to do that is really building an end balance in the first place. I think thinking about your farm, you really have to have a good handle of how much nitrogen is going into that system in the first place, from commercial applications, manure, legumes, considering all of those factors together, and then looking at how it behaves, in terms of yields and how much nitrogen is removing from that system. So we have to know what's happening if we're going to be able to. And then the next one is really trying to balance out that nitrogen supply and demand. And so we can start to reduce that end surplus. So there's a couple ways you can do this. There's different nitrogen rate studies. Here in Wisconsin, we have the nitrogen optimization pilot program right now, which is a great opportunity to experiment with some nitrogen. I know I was just reading about a study here in Western Wisconsin looking at commercial fertilizer application rates in treatments that had poultry manure. And what they were able to see is that where they had the poultry manure, they could reduce their commercial fertilizer by about 20 or 30 pounds and still get the same amount of economic benefit, showing that there was a lot of nutrients to be used from that manure. And while 20 or 30 pounds reduction on 1 acre might not seem like a lot, if we scale that up to, tens, hundreds, or thousands of acres, we can really start to make a dent potentially in reducing some of that nitrate leaching and that surplus N. And then the next one I have is about managing low yielding areas of the field. So this comes from a conversation I had with a farmer last growing season. And he was telling me that when he was a kid, if his family ever had extra manure or fertilizer, his dad would always tell him to go spread it on those lower yielding areas of the farm because they could really needed the boost. And he said now that he's gotten older and he's managing the farm himself, he's realized that some portions of the farm are always going to be low yielding, whether that's from, compaction or shading or maybe some pest management issues. And that really, it's better to put that nitrogen on areas of the field, whether that's from manure or fertilizer that have that higher yield potential because they're more likely to be able to make use of that extra N. And so while this farmer wasn't necessarily talking about, the N surplus or nitrate leaching hotspots, I think it really tells a story. We have to be thinking about kind of that whole scale landscape management and how nitrogen management can potentially differ on different portions of the field. So the next one is we want to try to reduce that surplus N balance. But again, we know our corn systems especially can be pretty leaky. So what are we going to do once we have that surplus N? And really, the goal is to protect it, especially during that springtime where we know the drainage is high and can be super vulnerable. So one way to do that is with cover crops. And when I say cover crops, we really want to think about prioritizing overwintering cover crops because those are going to provide the greatest protection in that spring time frame where we have those really challenging drainage conditions. And then also thinking a bit about cover crop biomass. So this graph I have here is adapted from my former colleague, Chelsea Zegler, based on a study they did in Maryland. And the blue bars are looking at cover crop biomass based on planting date. And kind of intuitively, you can see that the earlier a cover crop was planted, so for example, the 29th of August, we have a lot more biomass than a cover crop that was planted in October. And then that orange line is looking at cumulative nitrate leached. And you can see that leaching was a lot lower in those treatments that had higher cover crop biomass, because ultimately we had more roots demanding that nitrogen and protecting it before it could leach into groundwater. And so I know, of course, I'm showing a study from Maryland, and 29th of August might not be a realistic cover crop planting date for many of our systems here in Wisconsin, especially potentially a continuous corn or corn soybean. But I think it's just another time to think about, maybe what rotations exist to achieve these cover crop goals. Is there potential to introduce another crop that's maybe harvested a little bit earlier, where we could plant that cover crop and gain some of that biomass? Potentially planting green, other things like that to really extend that time where that surplus is protected. And then the third and final thing is really conducting local nitrate leaching research to fine tune our recommendations for Wisconsin. So with this approach, we're able to test the efficacy of conservation practices or really see what works here to reduce our nitrate leaching. So this can help us answer some of those questions like how much cover crop biomass do we need to have a meaningful impact on nitrate leaching? Is there a certain threshold we should be really striving for? And then what does nitrate leaching look like in Wisconsin under different soil types, rotations, and climate conditions that we have here? And of course, we're the dairy state. So how does manure impact the surplus end balance in nitrate leaching dynamics? Which is why I'm always super happy to share the stage with Dr. Lindsay Hartfield, because Discovery Farms has kind of entered a new stage of monitoring and nitrate leaching research in dairy systems. So that's it for me, and I'm really excited to hand it over to Amber or Lindsay.
So Kelsey, I do have some questions it looks like that have come in via Slido, so we'll ask you some of those here. If Lindsay, if you want to switch over to your slides, we can do that now as we go here. So yes, Kelsey. So the first question I have is an interesting one, as it reads, how has nitrate leaching changed or evolved in the past decade or so? I feel like it's been more talked about and curious if it's spurred any noticeable change yet.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in terms of data that I'm really familiar to speak on, and Lindsay will talk about this, nitrate leaching research is relatively new in Wisconsin. We don't have a whole bunch of it, so it's kind of hard to really track changes over time. In some of our well water quality data, I would have to look back in at that DATCAP report, but I do think that we see a trend where we have increasing in some wells, decreasing in some, and it's kind of variable across the state. So I do think it's something that we need a bit more data on. But I do notice that a lot of people are talking about it and are interested in it, and I think that's great. You know, it encourages more experimentation across the state with things like the nitrogen optimization pilot program and some of the Discovery Farms work as well. So I think it's great that, you know, the conversation is happening, because we can study nitrogen for, you know, 200 years. It's such a dynamic nutrient and a lot to learn about it.
Most definitely is. And in one area that you had and you were talking about through some of your slides is, having cover crops and the biomass that goes in that is involved, excuse me, words are hard apparently, but with the cover crops that are involved when thinking about the amount of biomass that's on that ground, how much does that play an impact in the nitrate leaching? And is that an important thing that we really need to be thinking about and considering, or is having green in general just going to be better than nothing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think green in general is absolutely better than nothing. And especially too, when we talk about maybe some of our erosion, it can have other benefits. But I think when we're talking about nitrate leaching, we really do need to see some biomass to have that impact. So if you think about when people talk about cover crops, I'm sure you have an image in your mind, fields where, you know, you have the knee-high rye versus, you know, maybe the little stubble or it didn't catch. So I think the dynamics, you know, if as roots are demanding different amounts of N, I think it will have an impact on our nitrate leaching. But absolutely, some is better than none, and I think that's a good model to go by as well. And Lindsay might have some more to say on that with her research as well.
So I have another question that's on here, and I do want to say I'm going to hold this one until a little bit later because I want both Lindsay and Kelsey's thoughts on this one, as it's an interesting take on the question here. So with all that being said, for the moment, that is the last of the questions that I'm going to throw at you, Kelsey, specifically. Lindsay, if you want to take it away, then I think we are going to head into a little bit more Wisconsin-specific research.
Yeah, thank you, Amber, and thank you, Kelsey, for setting me up to really dive into this local data that we have. Before getting into the data, did want to provide just a quick overview of what the Discovery Farms program is. I know we've been saying it a few times throughout this, but haven't really explained what it is for those who might not be familiar. So the Discovery Farms program is a farmer-led research and outreach program within the Division of Extension at UW-Madison that conducts studies on private farms across the state to better understand the relationship between different agricultural practices and water quality. So Discovery Farms started in the early 2000s. Focus was more so on surface runoff, tile drainage. But as we've been hearing from Kelsey, there's been growing concern about elevated nitrate concentrations in our groundwater here in Wisconsin. And so Discovery Farms has recently moved into in-field nitrate leaching monitoring. And to do this in-field nitrate leaching monitoring, which is a mouthful, we use what we call equilibrium tension lysimeters. And so the goal with this monitoring equipment is to really be able to understand both the timing and magnitude of nitrate leaching that's happening in Wisconsin. So to do this, again, we're using what we call equilibrium tension lysimeters, a big mouthful, I'll probably just call them lysimeters going forward, but I'm gonna hopefully break this down into a few easily to understand steps. So our lysimeters are essentially, there are many different kinds of lysimeters, but I'm going to focus in on ours. And ours are essentially these metal boxes that are buried in the soil profile. And they're installed below that crop rooting zone to collect whatever water is infiltrating through that soil profile headed towards groundwater. And also as part of this lysimeter, we have to have a sample line then connected to the lysimeter to be able to pump it back out so we can know the total amount of drainage that has happened, and then also what is the concentration of that drainage water for nitrate. And then the last component here of this of these lysimeters is that they have a vacuum line attached to them. And this is there for a few reasons. If we didn't apply any suction at all to our lysimeters, the water would simply move around the lysimeters, similar to how they move around the rocks within the soil profile. We apply a small amount of suction, and that's there to mimic what's happening within that soil profile naturally. So naturally, the soil holds on to a little bit of water, so we're mimicking what it's doing, so we're hopefully capturing as close to what would naturally be happening within that soil. Okay, so then for those who are tuning in, you can see these pictures. I'll try to describe them as best as I can for those who are just listening in. But here I'm showing some pictures of what this installation process looks like to install these lysimeters. So this first step of the process is really to investigate that soil profile. We want to be below that crop rooting zone. And so this often puts us in the second layer down in that soil profile. So this picture showing that top layer is really dark, heavy, nice heavy organic matter layer. And then you can see where the soil profile changes and it's more of an orangish color. Then in this next set of images, this is a drone image of one of our installations. And so in this drone image, you can see there's some narrower lines, and those are trench lines for those vacuum and sample lines to be able to connect those off at the edge of the field so we're not in the way of the farm equipment. But also in the picture, there's a little bit bigger hole. And if you look carefully, you can see the metal box within that hole. There will be another picture coming up that's a little closer. Here it is. You can see the lysimeter inside that hole. You can see there's some of those lines connected to the lysimeter as well. And then in the next images, this is just showing how we're getting those vacuum and sample lines connected, placed in those trenches. And this last set of images shows our control boxes. I like to call the control boxes the brains of the operation. These control boxes have a program that runs to check those lysimeters, how much suction they have, if it needs to apply a little bit more to make sure it's kind of mimicking the natural soil profile. And this is also where we collect those water quality samples from. For these lysimeter projects, this nitrate leaching within the field, we use what we call a control and treatment study design. So as part of this study design, we have 8 lysimeters installed at each of our monitoring sites. 4 of those lysimeters are in what we call the control portion of the field, 4 are in what we call our treatment portion of the field. Initially in our monitoring, the whole field is managed exactly the same. And then once we get enough years of data, we can develop a relationship between those lysimeters. Then we can add a treatment in and see if there was a change, if by adding some kind of treatment, if we can reduce our nitrate leaching. So now I'm going to dive into one of our monitoring sites specifically. And this site that I'm going to focus in on is on a dairy farm in western Wisconsin in Pepin County. So prior to this crop, our monitoring, it was in corn grown for grain that year. It was fall of 2021 that the lysimeters went in. Then in 2022, they grew soybeans. Next year was corn silage. And then this past year was again soybeans. Other management information that is important is that they also planted a cereal rye cover crop following that corn silage in 2023. Then in terms of tillage, they practice reduced tillage using strip or vertical tillage. They did a single pass of tillage in 2023, but otherwise have not used any tillage, and then are able to, with that reduced tillage, keep a high level of residue on their field. And the last little bit of management information I'll highlight before getting into more specifics of the data is just some of their nutrient applications. So in 2022 with the soybeans, following that, they had some potash applied. And then going into the corn silage crop, they had broken up a lot of their nitrogen applications into smaller applications. So they had a liquid dairy manure that was injected into the soil in April. They applied some as starter when they planted their corn silage, and then they did some side dress. And then also this field is on a pretty sandy soil, so they have irrigation on that field. And so they did a fertigation application. So for those who aren't familiar with what that is, they're essentially just applying fertilizer through their irrigation equipment. Okay, so now getting into some of this weather data. I'm going to pause and say I'm not going to talk about our first year of monitoring simply because, as you saw in those pictures, there was a lot of soil disturbance that went into getting these lysimeters in place. And so the first year of data is really heavily influenced by that high level of soil disturbance. A lot of mineralization happens by mixing the whole soil profile up, and we put it back as best as we can to what we did, keep those soil profiles separated out. But it does influence those results. So I'm just going to highlight the second and third year of results because of that. So focusing in on 2023, here you're seeing the weather, the rainfall, and irrigation. So we have a weather station at the site, and it captures both rain and irrigation. So these are combined together on the graph. But the general trend from 2023 was that we had below average precipitation throughout the year. I'm sure many people can reflect back and remember that was a challenging year with how dry it was. But the site did have a very wet October. That was the only month that was like really notably very wet, almost double the average. And I will highlight that our rain gauge did get some debris stuck in it when the corn silage was harvested. So we have filled in that time period where the rain gauge wasn't functioning quite properly with a nearby station. But again, just highlighting that month was really above average, and that'll come into play as we get into some more of this data. And then this past year, again, I'm sure people can remember it is a very challenging year to get in the field to do your field operations, with it being very wet, many months throughout the summer being just felt like the rain was never going to stop. So they had very, very wet conditions this past year throughout the summer. And then the faucet turned off and it got very dry this summer. This fall. So with that, I'm going to transition into talking about the drainage volumes that we've collected at this site. So in 2023, on this graph, if you're able to see it, we're showing drainage on that vertical axis, and then the months are on the horizontal axis. And a year of data for us runs from April 1st to March 31st. The reason we kind of define it as that way, not the calendar years, we're trying to really align with the crop timing. So once we hit April, we know we're gearing up for the next crop. Nutrient applications that are maybe happening in the month of April are geared towards the crop that's going in this year, versus what we see leaching from in the fall and up to this point is from the previous crop. So that's why we define the year as April 1st to March 31st. So you'll see that on these graphs as well. But the general trend we saw in that first year was most of our drainage happened in that early spring timeframe, prior to the crop being fully established. And this really aligns with what Kelsey shared with us a few moments ago, with we don't have a crop really using any of the water at that point, see a lot of drainage happening. We did see a fair amount of drainage following that really wet October at this site. So we did see some drainage post-harvest. And for the whole year, we saw just shy of 5 inches of drainage happening at the site. Then this past year, like I said, the year ends March 31st, so we're not quite to the end of the year. So this is the data so far. And we have a few samples that are still in at the lab to be analyzed. So I don't have the full picture, but based on what we've been seeing, I'm not expecting these numbers to change a whole lot. We don't have a lot of drainage happening in the winter months. So far this year, we've had quite a bit more drainage than the previous year, over 8 inches of drainage so far. But in contrast to the previous year, most of our drainage happened during the growing season. So this is a bit different than what the study Kelsey shared with us as well. But again, this year was a pretty different year than we've had in a lot of years, with just so much rain during that growing season. So most of it happened during the growing season, but we did still see some before planting and then post-harvest. I should have pointed out on these graphs that there are dashed lines showing when the crop is planted and when it's harvested, and then if a cover crop is in, when that was planted or terminated. So that's also on these graphs. Now we'll focus in on our nitrate leaching. So in 2023, now on this graph, there's also green dashed vertical lines, and those are when those nitrogen applications were made. So as a reminder, there was manure, some starter applied, side dress, and then that fertigation later in the year. What I want to point out here is that throughout that growing season, we had consistently low nitrogen leaching. This is also a nod to the farmer that we're working with. They're irrigating on this field, so it does show that they're not over irrigating. They're really well managing their irrigation. We're not seeing any large drainage events or large flushing out of the system following any of their irrigation applications there. What we did see is a higher event later in November, and this follows that wet October. I also want to point out, though, that this was a longer time period between collecting the samples. We work with project partners, the Pepin County Land Conservation Planning and Zoning Department, and they had some staff turnover during this time. So instead of sampling bi-weekly, which you see throughout that summer month, they're out there there's about 2 points for every month on this graph. They had some staff turnover, so it was about a 2-month time period. So the magnitude of the point is accurate. Resolution of the sampling is a bigger scale than the rest of the year. So that's part of it being a bit higher on the graph if it had been broken up into 2-week samples there. And then so far in 2024, the nitrate has just consistently been low before planting, throughout the growing season, despite it being so very wet. And then even after harvest, it's remained pretty low this past year. I'm gonna wrap things up together now by putting it on a cumulative scale. So this is if we just keep adding every event on top of the previous one across the whole year. So we're just continuing to add up each individual event. So if we look first at 2023, again, highlighting that there was low leaching during the growing season, and we can see this because there's just a really slow, gradual increase in the cumulative nitrate leaching. There's no big jump. The only jump that really happens is that following that really wet October, the jump we saw in November, and this was a combination of a large drainage event, but also this was a higher concentration event. So this does indicate that there was a nitrogen surplus, as Kelsey was highlighting, in our system. So this is again following corn. We know it's a little bit of a leakier crop. It wants a lot of nitrogen, but not maybe the most efficient at using it. So we did see that there was a little bit of a surplus, and with that above average wet October, we did see that jump happen. On total, right around 50 pounds per acre for the year. If we think back again a few moments ago when Kelsey was sharing that meta-analysis with us, the average for corn was just over 30 pounds per acre. So we're a little bit above that, but within the range of what was seen in that study. And then this past year again, we see just again a really slow gradual increase. It's kind of really just kind of stationed out, plateaued out, no real increase happening since for sure about mid-September into October. It really hasn't increased a whole lot since then. So again, just low leaching this past year overall. And if we look at the total number, we're sitting at right around 21.5 pounds per acre. Again, not quite complete with our year yet. But if we think back again to that meta-analysis from Kelsey, that had us at soybeans having an average of 25 pounds per acre. So we're just under that. I think on the year, we'll probably end up pretty close to that average once we get those last few samples in from the lab. I do want to highlight that this was our first lysimeter monitoring site that we installed in 2021. We have since added 2 more one in Calumet County that is on a dairy forage rotation, also receives dairy manure. And then we have 1 additional site in Rock County. These are also all areas of the state where there's some concerns about nitrate in our groundwater. So summarizing, what are we learning from this monitoring so far? In the first year of monitoring, again, just highlighting that there was a lot of soil disturbance, so we're not going to rely on that data as being accurate reflection of the system. In the second year of monitoring, it was overall a pretty dry year, but did have a wet October. So we saw one large leaching event that contributed most of our nitrate leaching for the year, and that followed crop harvest and heavy precipitation. So kind of a challenging situation where there was a cover crop planted, but not able to take up a lot of that nitrogen yet since it was still getting established. And that indicated again that there was a nitrogen surplus in the system. But one thing that was of interest to us was that there were several of those fertilizer applications during that growing season, and during that time period, we didn't see any large leaching events following those. So that's something we'll plan to continue to assess in the future to see if that's a practice that will work to keep our nitrate leaching lower. And then this past year, again, we're wrapping up the data, but it was a really challenging year with a lot of rain, but so far much lower losses than the previous years. And then I kind of want to just close this all together by wrapping up from what Kelsey shared and what we saw from this study. So next steps for Discovery Farms will be to introduce a treatment at this site to evaluate its effectiveness at reducing nitrate leaching. And as a dairy farm, they're interested in either looking at dairy manure timing or placement. So it's going to be one or maybe both of those things together is going to be the treatment at this site. And then just kind of, again, summarizing what we've heard today, want to really send the message home that there are some strategies we have that we can use to reduce our nitrate leaching. The first bin of this is to reduce that nitrogen surplus, try to balance the nitrogen supply and demand out. As Kelsey highlighted, we can do things like a nitrogen rate study. We can manage those low yielding areas of the field. But other tools can be splitting those nitrogen applications up so we're not at risk if we have really extreme weather events that we're not flushing out if we apply it all at one time. Make sure we're properly crediting manure and legume credits, and then again, Kelsey highlighted using diverse crop rotations does show some promise at also helping this. And then that last bin of protecting the nitrogen surplus balance that we do have by having an overwintering cover crop to make sure it's using up some of that nitrogen during that shoulder season. And just want to thank all the groups on this slide. Without them, this research is not possible, especially our participating farmer. Without him, we wouldn't have any of this data to begin with. And then obviously project partners, funders, they're all really, really important people as part of this.
Well, Lindsay, we've got some questions for you, as well as, we're going to have Kelsey jump back in for this other one here. But I'm going to start with the question that just came in, actually, looks like pretty recently. And it reads, if cover crops aren't an option at the moment, what's the best way to increase nitrate leaching uptake, or is that not possible since there isn't the demand there? And I think that was touching on what you just mentioned here at the last portion.
In 2023 they did have a cover crop, but it was still getting established, so it didn't have much roots there yet. At the time of freeze up, it still wasn't a really well established cover crop. It was only about 5 inches tall, but 60% cover on the field. If we don't have something living, there's really not a whole lot we can do to stop the nitrate from leaching if something's not there to pull it up and take it and hold on to it. So that is our grand challenge, I think, for nitrate leaching in that shoulder season. So really, if we can get a cover crop established and going, and in this case, often we don't have super wet falls in Wisconsin. We'll see what happens in the next couple of years if that trend is changing. But in this case, it was kind of a combination of a challenging wet period plus the previous crop being done and the cover crop not quite established.
Okay. And one of the questions that I have, especially as you've got a couple lysimeters in place and it looks like there's going to be some good data coming from those, but what are some other ways, if at all, that is measured nitrate leaching? What can, farmers be thinking about maybe if they're like, well, this is something that's interesting to me, maybe I want to get involved. What does that look like on a personal level, but maybe even on a more in-depth level with getting involved?
Yeah, so we're expanding the network, trying to grow our understanding, knowledge, but we love to engage with farmers who are interested in this, want to hear from them. These lysimeters, they are a fairly costly practice to put into place to monitor this, but we are starting to find some lower cost options that farmers can use. They don't give maybe the same resolution or like level of detail in terms of like this many pounds of nitrogen leached, but one tool is they're called resin lysimeters. They're little like PVC pucks that go in your soil. And it's a good tool if you want to see like, does a cover crop help? It's a good like comparison of, it can tell like magnitude, like there was more nitrate leaching in this area of the field versus this area. So it doesn't give you the numbers, but it is a low cost tool. And if you're interested in that, you can reach out to myself or Kelsey. We can get you hooked up with people who are putting those in the field. That is one thing that it's definitely growing across the state, a lot of interest in those. And we do have some of those installed alongside of our more expensive lysimeters to see if we can build a little better relationship of the information we get from those resin lysimeters and see if we can get a little bit more information from them.
Well, that sounds really awesome. I didn't know those existed, so that's really cool. The one question that came in earlier that, I mean, Kelsey, if you want to jump in on, feel free to, but I find it an interesting question that I didn't know myself. So this one reads, when taking low yielding fields out of production, does it help to not only reduce nitrate leaching since it's not being applied to that area of ground, but is that also compounded then on the fact that if it's planted in something else like prairie grasses, that it might have an uptake demand? So how does that all work? Does it compound on the factors, or is it one or the other?
Yeah, I think probably the big thing to begin with is that if you weren't adding more nitrogen, you could potentially have that lower nitrogen surplus. The other thing that's interesting, if it was like planted to a perennial or kind of totally taken out of production, I think there is some evidence if you're able to accumulate some organic matter and get that nitrogen that is there, like in a safe portion. So there is some potential for that. And I think there is some emerging research in Wisconsin, or they're doing some analysis on that. So I think it could be both, but really the big thing is probably you're adding a bit less of that nitrogen to the system in the first place. So, but I don't know if Lindsay has more thoughts on that to add.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we don't have the data specifically to that question, but I would say also, yeah, it should be pulling up nitrogen, which would be an added benefit, and it would have roots in place. If you're retiring that area of the field completely, would have roots in place year round, which is a big bonus there.
Okay. One of the other questions that I have here is, as we're thinking and talking about nitrates, nitrate leaching, all of that, we know that it's a newer area of study. We know that there's a lot more that's starting to come about, but there's still a lot of gaps that exist in this area. So what are some of those gaps that you guys see, but also know that maybe there's some studies that are coming down the line for that? What can we kind of keep an eye on for the future, if you will?
Yes, it's definitely a growing area of research for the state. There was these same lysimeters. There was more of them that went in at Arlington on the research station there. There is going to be more going in the Central Sands. So I think from all of these together, we should be able to get a lot better understanding. Right now, we don't have the most data behind like timing, how much is normal in the state, and then the real question is like, what can we do to help reduce it? So diving into like the conservation practices, the management of the fields, what can we do to reduce that risk? So that's things that we're hoping to have coming down the pipeline, but we don't quite have the answers yet.
Well,
and Kelsey, feel free to chime in
yes.
too.
Well, I think it's great too that Discovery Farms has this monitoring and systems with manure, because I think that's something, nitrogen management with manure is really complicated and can be challenging in terms of nitrate leaching. So I think we have a lot more to learn on that, and really excited that we'll have some like local data to kind of, help us understand that a bit better.
Well, a lot of exciting things to keep an eye on and see what comes about, especially on the producer side, especially when we're talking about what can we do, because I think that's always where everybody wants to go, and we're getting more information and we have a lot of good ideas and stuff, but having that information to back what the practices are is always so important as well. So excited to see what comes from that. But as we kind of begin to wrap up our time here this afternoon for Lindsay and Kelsey, we've had a lot of really good information come across in this discussion, but what's one or two key things that you want producers to be thinking about or actively doing after today's discussion?
I can go first, and I guess for me, I think just taking away just an awareness that like nitrate leaching is happening. It is something we're seeing in the state. And then just, I mean, trying to be aware of if we can do some studies to understand if we're applying the right amount of nitrogen, if we have too much. We all know nitrogen fertilizer, it can be pretty expensive. So if we can match the crop need with what we're applying as best as we can. All of us want to keep it in place. So we can work towards that common goal, balance out that supply and demand. And if we do have that excess, that surplus nitrogen, we can protect it some way. That would be the key takeaways for me. And hopefully more to come on management from the Discovery Farms data set in the years to come.
Well, thank you, Lindsay. And Kelsey, what would you have to say are your key takeaways?
I think key takeaways is just really encouraging farmers and producers to experiment with nitrogen management. I think we're in a really like special time in the state right now where we have these different opportunities through Discovery Farms or the nitrogen optimization pilot program, or even some of the farmer-led groups too are offering incentives to just experiment with nitrogen, and such a dynamic nutrient that changes from year to year in the weather. So I think one of the best things you can do is try different rates, try different things out on your farm. So I would encourage people to take advantage of some of those opportunities that we have right now in our state.
Well, thank you for that, Kelsey. I have to say, both Kelsey and Lindsay, thank you so much for your time here today. It is much appreciated as we talk about this topic that I know is on a lot of producers' minds, especially as it's a discussion piece for many, especially when we're thinking about our fields. And we know that getting in our fields is going to be sooner rather than later here. But I have to say thank you so much for your time here this afternoon. And I also have to say thank you to those who asked your questions. We always appreciate those coming through, and those listening after, we much appreciate it as well. But for now, thank you for another great episode of the Dairy Signal. Hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you here next week. Bye now.